So, good afternoon, and welcome back from wherever you've been. I'm Ann Lauterbach. I'm a poet. I teach in the Division of Languages and Literature and in the Milton Avery Graduate School of the Arts here at Bard College. And I am very, very happy to be chairing this afternoon's panel, which carries the somewhat disquieting and lugubrious title, Is Art Human? The Fate of Art in an Age of Machines. It reminded me not only of Benjamin, of course, but also of Jonathan Schell's seminal work, The Fate of the Earth. So without further ado, or we'll pick that sorrowful note up later maybe, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, who is Nicholson Baker, an acclaimed writer of fiction and nonfiction. His many books include the novels The Mezzanine from 1988, Vox, a novel, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Nicholson Baker is an acclaimed writer of fiction and nonfiction. His many books include the novels The Mezzanine, 1988, Vox, a novel, 1992, A Box of Matches, 2003, and The Anthologist from 2009. His nonfiction works include Doublefold, Libraries, and The Assault on Paper, which received the National Book Critics Circle Award for 2001, and Human Smoke, The Beginning of World War II, The End of Civilization for 2008. He has written on contemporary personal technologies, such as Kindle, Wikipedia, and video games for The New Yorker and the New York Review of Books. When I asked what he might speak about today, he said he thought he would mention some machines he had loved. Nicholson.
Well, thank you. I've only been to one Arendt conference, and it was so inspirational, and just it was one of those intense, full, packed weekends of thinking and sometimes disagreeing, and then nodding your head violently to show agreement. And I felt inspired, and I felt actually proud as a father to have my daughter be studying here at Bard and learning all this great stuff. So I'm honored to be asked to be a speaker, and I kind of like the title, Is Art Human? It felt to me more like some sort of meditational prompt. Sort of like one of those dried paper flowers that you drop in a bowl of water and watch it expand. Because it's, first you think, well, yes, of course. But then you think, well, what I wanted to do when I wrote that book was to make something that wasn't part of me, that was out there. And when you look at the thing that you've written that's come off a machine that probably weighed 20 tons and was sliced and wrapped and boxed and shipped places, that has weight, and you look at the lines on the page, they're very linear, and they're grid-like, and they have a kind of machine born and machine bound quality to them, which is part of the excitement. The excitement is that you've come up with something that's juicy, that's in your mind, and is now inhuman, that is not you, that is pretending, that is sort of a simulation of being human, that you hope someone else will be able to reconstitute with his or her eye by skimming it across all those tiny serifs that are waiting to be picked up and made to come alive again. So, is art human? I thought, okay, how am I going to respond to that? And I began by making a list of the it was The Fate of Machines, The Fate of Art in an Age of Machines, I guess is the subtitle. What machines really inspired me as a kid? And I made a list. And I wrote down the carousel slide projector, because there's that beautiful swallowing sound that it makes when it switches to a new slide. And it's just, and my father was in the ad business, and he was kind of a carousel slide projector jockey. He got 2 or 3 going at the same time, and they had to have a tape recorder with special beeps that would be sent to each slide projector so they could switch in tandem so that you could get fade outs. And all of that mechanical, clunky, clicking, Kodak complexity leads to something that fades in and out on a screen. It has a kind of insubstantial, reflected quality, a glow to it. And another thing that really hit me when I was a kid was the piano. That is probably the greatest machine of modern times. It's the machine of beauty. It's what Debussy called a box of hammers. And it's so complicated, and it's so tall when you're a little kid. You can set up your plastic army men underneath it and have little battles. And then you can pretend to drive the piano with the pedals. And if you flip your right foot off the right pedal and then catch it a certain way, the whole piano will make this kind of tremendous thrumming sound that's all the wires at once. And so you feel that you're in control of a machine in some very basic way. Escalators were important to me as a kid. Very important, and in fact I wrote my first novel as a kind of celebration of an escalator ride. The guy is on his lunch hour, and he begins by getting on the escalator and the novel ends by his getting off the escalator. So it's kind of a travel book. He goes from the first floor to the mezzanine level, and then he's done. But that's because I really liked escalators a lot as a kid, and I felt that they were underappreciated in the American novel. Another kind of machine that I liked a lot, because we subscribed to the New York Review of Books, I liked the machinery in a way, or the mechanicalness of David Levine drawings. I liked the fact that there were all these tiny cross-hatchings if you looked carefully, all this replication, all this stuff that looked very mechanical, little tiny motions of the hand that were parallel, that didn't seem human. And then when you pulled the page back, there was Virginia Woolf or something, and it was both the ability to do this very precise, almost mechanical, perfect, parallel kind of movement, and to create a human face, which is probably the hardest challenge for any artist, is to do something with eyes and the highlights are just right and the person is recognizably who he or she is. AR turntables, I don't know if any of you were from that generation, but those were beautiful. Steam engines, on-off switches. We had a number of different kinds in my house, and that was the first word I learned was light, because I switched the light switch on and off. We had the kind that you pushed in and out because it was an old house. And wallpaper patterns fascinated me because I knew that they were not the way they looked. They were not huge. They were obviously one pattern replicated. And I think that's what part of the appeal, the fascination, the kind of, intoxication of these machines is the fact that small irregular things are repeated so that you get to see something that looks like a locally chaotic vine, and then you realize it's the same locally chaotic vine as is 3 feet over here. It's the same feeling that you get maybe if you think about a big automobile factory and you think of all the bumpers lined up, and they're all irregular, they're all chrome, and they all fit together. But they're all irregular in the same way. Shutters, camera shutters, that beautiful clicking sound that means that something very tiny and perfect is happening, that's a measured instant of time that's been measured off and clicked and is done. I loved camera shutters. And I wrote a piece about movie projectors for the New Yorker because I didn't know how they worked. I thought I knew how they worked. I thought they worked the way they worked in my junior high school classes, where there was always a guy who was the really adept person who was charged with loading the movie projector. And it made the clicking sound and everything. But it turned out that movies were projected from these giant platter systems. So I found out about that and wrote about that for the New Yorker and watched the Charlie Chaplin movie. I think somebody showed it as on a PowerPoint earlier, but Chaplin in his movie is going through something that looks like some crazy production line, and he's actually scooting down around something, and suddenly you realize that he's actually he's threading himself through his own movie projector. And it's a beautiful thing that he is using the movie projector as an idea of a kind of forbidding alien presence in his life, something that he has to thread himself around, and yet it's the medium that allows him to be most fluidly Charlie Chaplin. But then, I made this list, and then I thought, well, wait, now none of those machines are the machines that I really think of when I think of a human machine. And I came up with the one that I first really loved as a kid, and that was the yellow, big yellow. It began as a sound on the street where I lived in Strathallan Park in Rochester, New York. I would hear this sound, and I'd go to the window, and it was the big yellow street sweeper. It was this enormous machine that had a kind of moan a moan of the central engine, and then it had this irregular sound, which were all the bristles. And I never knew when it was going to come by, and it was like this tremendous accession of good luck when I would be able to look out the window and see this thing. And what it did was it had two front bristles, big, and they were really, I think they were organic bristles maybe, that would turn, and then when they turned inward. So the machine would actually be going along, and the bristles, and I really loved this, the bristles were turning in a direction that was opposite to the way the bristles were actually resisting the forward motion of the street sweeper. I never thought of the man in the street sweeper. I never thought of him because he was invisible. He was behind. He was hidden in the top of this tower of machinery. And then in the back was another huge bristly thing that would turn also in the opposite direction. And there was something so beautiful about the idea that the cleaning, that the actual sweeping progress was in opposition to the forward motion of this machine, that it was fighting itself in order to sweep my own street, And the other thing that I liked about it was that it was outlining things. It was saying to the street, you're just a street, but I'm going to come and clean you up. I'm going to make your edge be more defined, which is part of the challenge or the pleasure of being somebody who's in the art business, is that you get to draw a line around things. You get to outline them and say, this is where the way that the line actually goes. And the street sweeper was there, and though I didn't see him, he was outlining the street. He was saying, I am going to celebrate you this Tuesday morning at 4:35 a.m. And then he was also, though, he was forgiving. He said, there's a car in front of me. It's parked. It's one of those people who didn't see the sign Tuesday morning, go on the other side. It's parked. So I'm just going to veer outward and go around. And you could actually follow later in the morning, you could follow the path that the street sweeper had made when it veered out and forgave, in a way, the car for being parked there. So that was my I guess, most inspirational machine. I don't think of machines, or I didn't think of machines then as being oppressive and frightening and awful. I thought that the job of the artist was to rehumanize them. That if we're going to ride the escalator every day, we had to figure out why that was interesting. If we watched movies that came from movie projectors, we had to find out what about the movie projector was odd and interesting and worth thinking about. And it turns out that in the middle of the movie projector, there's this device, this star that has to shift suddenly and then shift back in a perfect kind of way, and the engineering of it has to be perfect. I interviewed the guy who was in charge of making these Maltese cross stars, and you know, the notion of being an artist, the privilege of being an artist, I guess, or trying to be an artist, is that you get to kind of look around the world and say, what is it that is really proof of the fact that life is full of interest and exciting and worth living, and a lot of the stuff that makes it fun and worth living is all these technical innovations. So that's why I ended up writing about the street sweeper. And this last book that I wrote is about a poet, and he's supposed to write an introduction to a work of poetry, and he puts it off. And I wrote it with the help of a machine. I set up a video camera and videotaped myself in all sorts of different places in the house, and then stripped out the audio and transcribed it, and then had an enormous transcript of a person pretending to be a poet who is pretending to explain iambic pentameter. There's another machine. Iambic pentameter and all of poetic meter is this imposition of sameness on something that wants to be a little different. The syllables want to go here and there, but you've got this grid that you separate down on it. So here's this poet trying to explain all that, and I wanted to explain it in a way that would pull from me some of the real feeling of explanation. So I set up a video camera and taped myself in various parts of the house and outside in our yard in a white plastic machine-made chair, and then I transcribed it all, and then I had this enormous transcript, and then I did a final sort of machine-inspired step, which I'd never done before, which was to assign random numbers to each of these transcribed chunks. So I went to random.org, which is a place where you can get beautiful random numbers that are truly random, and I assigned them to these chunks and then put them in the order that the chunks gave me. Because I'd been, a musician, and I'd read about Xenakis, and he'd used random number tables, and I thought, well, I'll be a modernist finally, But the point for me was to then look at this randomized, chaoticized, messed up manuscript, and then to have to crawl back towards the human way to tell it, to have to fight back towards the way that was, in which it actually wanted to be said. Somehow I think that the nice thing that machines do is they destabilize us. They're big and powerful and wrong, and they set us off course. And part of the joy is then remembering that they actually are human products, and that they can be surrounded by thoughts that are kind of softened, I guess, by all sorts of analysis and thoughts that we have when we just deal with them day by day. So that's what I did, and thank you very much.
I need to say something about you.
Okay.
As you go up there, I'll say that some of us were lucky enough to hear yesterday David Rothenberg, composer and musician, who has worked with, as he said, birds, bugs, and whales. He has written widely on music, nature, and the philosophy of technology. Why Birds Sing was published in 6 languages and is about making music with birds. His most recent book, 1,000 Miles Song, comes with a CD, whale music. In 2010, his first major label, ECM Records, released a duet with pianist Marilyn Crispell. He is professor of philosophy and music at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. His talk today is called Music in the Age Beyond Representation.
Something like that. Thank you.
No.
Thanks, Anne. Yes, I told Roger I would talk about the work of music in the age beyond mechanical reproduction. Because, this is Bard College. Everyone knows that Walter Benjamin wrote about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And he was really worried that artworks would lose their individual aura if they could be reproduced all over the place. Everyone could have a poster of the Mona Lisa on their walls and such. And what's interesting is it seems to me that in music this essay has been talked about the most, because music has been the most transformed of the arts with mechanical reproduction, because in music people figured out how to create the aura, to add a different kind of aura in music once it was recorded, because recording became this way that a performance of music could be immortalized and heard over and over again. People could hear it all over the world. They could hear it for decades, for 100 years. They could hear a performance, and it just happened in one moment. Some music was played, and now it exists. It's reproduced all over the place, and everyone can hear it. And for many decades, this was how music became a thing. It became an object. It was bought and sold. It became a whole industry, a whole part of culture. And then this mechanical reproduction got so good, it was so successful, that all of a sudden everyone could have as much music as you want all the time and carry it around. Now, lots of students are carrying around thousands of songs at any one time. It used to, you imagine 20 years ago, you'd be lugging along a whole house full of records. And, it's an amazing thing. This is the kind of thing that Ray Kurzweil might say, an exponential graph. How much music everyone has, how much can be carried around, and of course, this is one of the things that's destroyed the music industry as a business. That how can you sell music as a thing if it's just there? All these recordings, these wonderfully, carefully, worked on recordings of music, everyone can have them all the time. And now you carry them around. In just a few years, you won't have to carry anything around. It'll all be there to be listened to at any time. And so, what's happened to music in this world? And a lot of discussion is about how are musicians going to make any money in this world when music is just everywhere. It's kind of devalued and made free. I'm always asking students, how much do you want to pay for a song you like? They always say, nothing, of course, 0. Why would you possibly pay any more than 0? So what about these musicians who, made these records, and they worked hard, and they can sell T-shirts. This is what people say, and it's T-shirts can be sold, and it's interesting. The first person to complain about this sort of thing was John Philip Sousa, who wrote an essay in a newspaper because he was worried that these newfangled recording machines were being developed, and who's going to play band instruments, and why would we need this if we could hear music whenever? And so the concern of musicians for making money has been around for a while. But I think that in a way, too much of this discussion is about this idea, the business side of things, like how will money be made, and much less about what really happens to the notion of music when we can have so much of it at any one time. And this is where I think is the most interesting aspect of this question, because so everyone can hear so many different kinds of music so easily, and you can carry around so much at any one time. How do we listen any differently having so much stuff? Do people think more about all the stuff that we have? Generally, I found not too much. People don't think what it means to have so many different things. I spent a day in a class a few days ago listening to 50 different versions of one piece. So easy to do. Let's really listen to all these and take the time and hear what the differences are and things that are almost exactly the same. You have all this stuff you can study and get involved with, but it takes a lot of attention and time, which people usually claim not to have too much of. To really spend time to make a different sense of all this music you can have and listen to, and really take it all in and spend more time with it, making sense of it. And that, there's kind of a responsibility, if you've got this much possibility, this much music, to hear many more different kinds of things, to listen to things you haven't heard of, to think about what it means to hear it all at once, Lots of easy things you can do. Find out what actually is the most listened to song on your iPod. It's usually not what you expect. You think you like one kind of music, some other thing you've listened to more than anything else. I was really surprised to find out what was the most popular song on my own device that I carry around. And, is it the best thing that all this, to think that, every musician that I know has some issues with the idea that all their music they spend time recording is going to be free. They don't really like that idea because, it's true, it's much easier to make these, to make recordings that sound so good. It's so much easier than it was, just a few years ago. And if you're a performing musician, a classical musician, you want to enter a conservatory, it's assumed you will have a flawless audition tape without a single error. They assume everyone will record themselves, send it in, and edit it and adjust it so it's as perfect as possible, which doesn't entirely make sense because they're auditioning for something where they play in person, an actual acoustic instrument, which could be very different than the recording that one makes. Which leads me to another side of the idea of the work of music in the age beyond mechanical reproduction. I say beyond because the reproduction isn't mechanical, it's digital. So much has been reproduced, It's just produced in this realm. And it's just, there's so much of it. Like other aspects of information, music is the first art that really gets taken over by these technologies because it works so well for music. If you want to see a film, it's still better on a bigger screen than you have at home most of the time. So you can, I've a lot of friends and students, they go to live concerts, they say, it sounded so much better at home or on my headphones, and why would I want to go to this, But made me think about another part of the work of music is the work of playing musical instruments. And one of the books recommended that you should read before coming to this conference by Jaron Lanier, who is one of the inventors of the phrase virtual reality and virtual reality technology. He's also a musician, and he's always said this interesting thing, that he said throughout history, musical instruments are the most advanced technologies of cultures throughout history. Not weapons or cars or, buildings, but musical instruments. It's because they enable people to, they're carefully worked on to enable a musician to express things that you cannot express without this instrument, that you can't quite understand. Anyone who plays a musical instrument knows you can do things you can't explain once you learn to play it. And it takes time to learn to play these instruments. And, so Jaron collects odd musical instruments from all over the world. He has a house full of these things, really strange things, and spends a lot of time learning to play them. And they're all, they're not electronic instruments for someone who comes out of the Silicon Valley software world. Some people are surprised at this. They're all acoustic instruments, wind instruments, stringed instruments. And because he says, the time you spend with an instrument that's developed over a real long amount of time, you learn so much about yourself, what you can express, and you can do things you can't do without this technology, this tool. It really extends human intention and ability in ways that are very mysterious and beautiful. And I'm playing music on old-fashioned instruments like clarinets and also using computers. And the great thing about the computer is you can do anything so quickly. You can change any sound into anything else. And you can do this, what I'm talking about, you can listen to a lot of different sounds at the same time. You can play 10 of your favorite songs simultaneously and see what they do and slow down one part and speed up another and take a little clip and repeat it over and over again. So you can hear in this whole new, all-at-once kind of way. But what you can't do is spend years learning to play it, because in just a year or two, all the technology changes. It's totally different. It changes so fast, it's very hard to have a computer or electronic instrument that you could spend years learning to play because it changes so quickly. So sometimes the best technologies don't change so quickly. And Nicholson Baker was talking about the piano, this amazing invention. It was invented so you could hit a key and it sometimes would be soft and sometimes loud. This was an amazing innovation, a simple thing they figured out. And one friend of mine, a composer, writes mostly piano music, said it's important that the piano, that each note is a boring sound. If it was a complex, beautiful sound like a synthesizer makes, you just hit the sound and listen to it. It's amazing. But if you want to play all these notes and write music for it and study it for hundreds of years of development, this single sound can't take over too much. That's what this friend told me. And I think it's, we need to have technologies that we're able to spend a lot of time learning to work with. We can't just have technologies that change so fast, they transform everything about our lives so quickly, because it makes sense to spend time with things. But as you know, we have a world where these things are all being, mixed together and brought together, and I certainly don't think machines have ever been, something that are going to really make art of their own volition and interest. That's some people at this conference, are interested in things like that. I think they're making a leap of faith that technology will become something it's never been, some kind of really independent thing that wants to do things, that has a real aesthetic sense. That's what people have. We invent tools that we can use, that we love, that we can like. And, art is definitely human, but, it's not only human. All kinds of animals are making music and art, and it connects us to the larger natural world, I think. But with machines, we should use them, but the best ones are those that extend our ability to do things rather than make it look like they're doing things on their own. So I'll stop there for the moment. So thanks.
I have this sense most of the people I know who make art have a will to circumvent the confrontational aspect of things like technology versus art. Almost all the people I know who make art think, technology, great, I'll make some art, and go on. So I think all three of you sort of made that clear. We don't have all that much time. We have exactly half an hour. And I know there are lots of you in the audience, particularly students, who might want to ask some questions or make some comments. So I want to invite you to do that. And if you can, frame your questions to not more than like 30 seconds, then we can get as many people in as possible. So without further ado, let me just see if I can find an actual student person. You might be a student person, gentleman there in the back.
So this is directed to David. I found it interesting when you talked about the limitations of electronic instruments, because I don't know. For me, there's an aspect of tangibility to the interface with which you interact with electronic instrument that makes all the difference. In some aspects, some electronic instruments are almost devoid of physically tangible interfaces. You sequence things in, you code in the actual notes. On the other hand, some instruments, like a program called Ableton Live, are tangible in real time and sort of act like loop pedals on steroids. And so I guess my question is, where do we draw the distinction between hybrid instruments, like combinations of acoustic instruments that are connected to these kinds of electronic instruments? What kind of instrument is that when it is hybridized? And how do you think that the capabilities of that compares to a purely acoustic instrument, which, as you said, maybe sometimes not changing is a good thing?
Yeah, that's, what I played yesterday is a real example of one answer to your question, because I was using Ableton Live, this software that a lot of musicians like, because you can play into it, you can change all the sounds. It never stops making sound. It's very oriented towards playing live. So it's allowed people to create a whole new kinds of music. And I was very interested a few weeks ago to go meet the inventor of this software, because he was at RPI doing a concert, Robert Henke. And this software was invented in Berlin for like techno dance music. And, Henke was saying that's all he's interested in, like music with this regular kind of beat. He wasn't interested in other things that you could do with this. That's how he got interested in making such a thing. And then and I was saying, what I like to do is turn off all the automating sequencing features to make every track in a different time and different rhythm. So it ends up with these very strange overlapping rhythms, changing the possibility of what you can hear simultaneously. And so, not that approach is any better than the one the inventor intended, but nevertheless, in the whole process, the more fun to play electronic instruments, you feel like you do something and something cool happens. But there's a real difference between that and an acoustic instrument, because if I play an electronic keyboard or an electronic digital clarinet type thing, I can do something and any possible sound can come out, depending on how I set it up. And that's a little disarming compared to like learning to play a tone a certain way. And it's just like one sound. It takes you like 10 years to figure out how to play it. And, it takes a long time. And someone has to tell you that, it's worth spending that time. There's a famous musician joke, like what's the definition of an optimist? It's like, it's an old joke. So it's a clarinetist with a pager. Do you remember what pagers are? That's an optimist. So who cares about this? You have to believe that the time spent learning this enables you to make some art that's worth the effort. And my personal solution is to kind of combine these things together, but not get too caught up in the fact like it's too easy to record cool, interesting electronic music. It's more fun to play it live and make it always be different. But the idea of turning it into this work, there's so much recorded already. You have to really figure out how you as a person extend your possibilities through this technology, and kind of a long-winded answer to a perhaps technical question, but I think you get what it's about. It's an important thing to think about.
Yes. Keep you running back and forth.
Hi. This question is based on something, David, you just said about the best machines are those that extend our abilities, not those that look like they're doing it themselves. And it made me think of the automaton, the mechanical doll, and sort of this idea that the automaton looks like there's no agency involved, like it's just doing everything on its own. And then I was thinking that all art objects look like that. So a dancer's body also looks like there's no agency. A painting also looks like that. And sort of, art objects in general. And I was just thinking that maybe in this age of sort of infinite product and infinite information is something that art wants to do. Is it about illuminating the process of art maybe rather than the product, and where does that fit into what you've all been discussing and what we discuss every day here at Barth?
Somebody want to
answer that one?
Well, we're always told. I remember reading in some child care manual that process, not product. It's a good thing because you never know where you're going to end up with a kid. And if you believe in process, then you enjoy the whole thing. And if the banana got squashed on the coloring page, that's okay because that's the process. And I think it's a nice thing to think about it when you're writing a book, actually, because there's so many collisions and wrong turns and things that you think you're working toward that turn out to be things that you should never have bothered to say. That really you come to, or at least I sometimes trick myself into coming to the point where I think, well, I mean, what I'm doing really is showing how it's done. I'm showing how I felt my way towards something tentatively that was perhaps a little self-contradictory, but it was the best I could do on that Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, I was just, it's a nice question because I think it brings maybe into the conversation the relationship between materiality and form, which is really what you're talking about when you're saying process. And what artists do basically is take any material that is their material and make forms. And in that relationship, hopefully, make available meaning, which is a word that has completely not been even brought up in this conference, oddly enough, which I think redounds back onto this whole idea of machinery, and whether machines can make meaning, or whether only really humans can make meaning, and whether art objects aren't the kind of exemplar of that idea. So it seems really important. Also, I'm happy that you mentioned paintings, because for whatever reason, all the people on this panel are based on what we call in the MFA time-based media, and there's a kind of ineluctable convenience in having time-based media, film, music, and writing, which are so beautifully adept at marrying technology, whereas things like painting and sculpture, for example, and architecture resist that seamlessness. So that's something I think also worth thinking about, because it brings up the problem, which I think has been articulated differently here, of presence. You know, what it means to be present, and embodied as opposed to disembodied. Maybe by now even a cliche, but something worth thinking about in terms of why we go and look at art or think about art at all.
I'll say one thing.
Yeah.
Just the idea off of Anne's idea of presence. I think that a lot of 20th century art has been more conspicuously preoccupied with the notion of the artist's role in the making of the thing, and how the made becomes a part of, or the idea of the made and the making of it becomes part of the made. That begins, at least when we study modernism, it's supposed to start there as being a major thrust of the change of art. But if you've read Shakespeare and you've read Hamlet, you know a play within a play isn't just a play within a play. It's Hamlet's creator playing with the idea of what a play could be, and the idea that someone's actually writing the play. So I think a lot of artists through time, not just in the 20th century, and just as Nicholson's saying, you know, you're thinking about form at all times, but now we think about it more. And certainly postmodernism is the leap into thinking about it most.
Thank you. By the way, your remarks here reproduce one of the central concerns in a piece which I mentioned yesterday and Babich mentioned today, which is Kleist's Marionette Theater and the question of agency. And if you haven't read it, you'd find it something worthy worth pondering. All art seems to me at some point involved with questions of the technical, of technique. I mean, none of you don't have technique, and all of you have learned technique. On the other hand, no art seems to me subject to an exponential curve of getting better and better and better. And if you were to ask me whether or not Shakespeare is better than Donne, is better than Robert Frost, I wouldn't know in some sense. I certainly wouldn't be able to do it in terms of an exponential curve. That said, do each of you think there is something that allows us to call some work of art better than some other work of art? And if so, on the basis of what?
Well, I'll just make a little tiny comment, which is the great modernist call that I guess it comes in many different voices, but the clear voice that we hear as poets here is Ezra Pound, the great fascist, saying "make it new," and the value of newness as being tied to a fantasy of progression. And so that value, I think one of the things that's sort of interesting about where we are now is that value of newness has begun to dissipate because we understand that it's in bed with capital, just for a start, and also that history doesn't work that way. It's a dynamic, it's reciprocal, it's full of moments of indeterminacy that can't be, as we were told yesterday sort of wonderfully by Jane Bennett. There's this sort of sense of things that can't be tied to the linear in the way that the notion of newness might have thought it was possible in terms of valuing art. So how we come around to another kind of valuing of art, I'll lead to somebody else to speak of.
Yeah, I'm actually writing a book on this subject now about. Funny you should ask. It's about evolution and art and beauty and how part of it's about science and Darwin and about how for Darwin the aesthetics in evolution are really important. It's more accurate to say like evolution is survival of cool stuff, survival of the interesting rather than survival of the fittest. It was very important to Darwin that animals that just with wild colors and shapes and features and birds who sang totally crazy songs, these things evolved. It was very important to him to talk about this. And that science didn't like that idea too much. It's been ignoring that since Darwin's time. Very few people study the evolution of beauty. And another part of the book is trying to show, I'm not sure I've figured out how to show this, that art actually helps us understand nature better. And so this is not the only thing I think is one sense that might make art better or worse, but for me that art that makes us see the world in a richer, more larger and more intense and beautiful way is better than art that doesn't do that. It's not the only thing, but one thing for me is an artwork that changes the way I see the world and makes me see more than I saw before, or hear more, or touch more, or feel more. I think that's good.
I'm not writing a book, but I'll let you all in on something, and I can give it afterwards. I have an algorithm that lets me know what... Tracy, if you want it afterwards, happy to share. It's open source. I agree with David in a very simple sense. I mean, what I read today was a collage of 5 texts that I did not write by Michel de Montaigne, Franz Kafka, Nicholson Baker, John Jeremiah Sullivan, and Guy Davenport. The process of selection that I went through was one of finding things that seemed to speak to the idea of how human beings, in all their wonderfully flawed subjectivity, look at whatever they're going to look at. And so I think the real answer to what is good is whenever you see Natumbe's chicken, you know it. And I think that the interesting conversations we can have about each of our favorite chickens is it's one of the chief things that we're here to do. It's to disagree about that, agree about that, think about that aloud, share things that we don't know before.
One of the things we heard yesterday morning was that consciousness is subjectivity. He actually said that. And I thought, it seems to me to be exactly wrong to imagine that human consciousness is located in subjectivity. It seems to be human consciousness is always about a relationship between a subject and something else. That's how consciousness forms. At least, certainly in terms of art making, it seems always in a relation to something outside of itself. That's what consciousness for me is. I don't know that I can know it other than in that relation.
Which is inherently a subjective situation, isn't it? Isn't that the notion of subjectivity purely? I mean,
what I just said, you mean? I feel like in order to be conscious, you need to be conscious of something, not just yourself.
You are conscious of something, but your something is not my something.
That's true.
Therefore, your something is subject to you, and mine is subject to me, and there is subjectivity. Is there a fallacy in there that I'm missing?
Now we're having fun.
Tracy groaned. Yeah.
I know how you. I know how I know when it's good, which is you read it and you go, oh my God, you bastard, that is so good. That's how you know. I mean, and you kind of talk to it, and it slows you down. I mean, it's actually the opposite of exponential whatever. It actually slows you down. You're slowed down to the point where you want to copy it out. You want to actually rewrite it.
Following up on that, it's good when it looks at you, not when you look at it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It talks to you.
Right. Babette Babish earlier mentioned the idea, I guess it was called a fact, that we as humanity, as the totality of acting agents in the world, are all implicated in what is occurring. And I don't feel that, like, to a certain extent, we can embrace our ivory mountaintop and like say, let's philosophize all day, but to not reckon with the realities of what is occurring and to sort of just relegate it to, oh, Ray Kurzweil is a Nazi and that's enough to say. Or somehow it doesn't feel like, if to simultaneously call something the future, like the future that he is projecting is going to be one that will be destructive and evil in unimaginable ways, and then to not do anything about it, just like where's the connection? Like how does saying, well, this is evil, are we content to simply let the world die because of the fact that we're aware that it's dying? Or is there a change that we are supposed to make as academics, as people who claim to be enlightened, and people who claim to be smart, and people that claim to be smarter than other people?
You know, nothing about what Ray Kurzweil said is real. You know, none of that's happening. We're not ignoring it. You know, he makes a leap of faith to think that exponential growth in certain aspects of technology actually makes a difference to the most important things about being human. That's a leap of faith. You know, we have computers millions of times faster than they were in the 1960s. What can we really do faster? We can't feel more because of this. We figured out how to sequence the genome. You know, that's a good one, but we don't quite know what all the sequencing means. We can't cure many diseases with the stuff we found out. We're just trying to figure that out. We still need a lot of time thinking, and so much of what, you know, we spent a lot of time looking at his final slide, which showed the increase of life expectancy, which interestingly enough goes like this. It's not an exponential graph because, you know, certain important aspects of human life are not subject to that kind of rule. I think the interesting thing to ask Ray Kurzweil is, you know, if you begin with his appearance on I've Got a Secret, age 17, which you should all watch on YouTube. You see this kid, he's really smart. He invents a computer that writes music, you know, and Bess Meyerson can't guess his secret. She was Miss America, and she was pretty smart, but she couldn't guess that was his secret. The next guy guessed what it was. But from that inventor, this brilliant inventor who invented optical character recognition and a reading machine for the blind and a really cool synthesizer, I want to know at what point he decided that this meant that in the future we were going to merge with machines. It's really a religion, what he's created. And it's, you know, faith. You know, earlier someone else said, James Hughes, he said, oh, the limitations of singularity thinking is, you know, the limitations are, there may be limitations to rationality. You know, maybe everything isn't rational, but the singularity approach is irrational. There's no evidence to say this is really going to happen. It's really fun stuff to think about. But it's not. There's nothing rational about it. It's a kind of spiritual leap.
Let me say directly to you that one of the things that unsettled me about Kurzweil was the number of times he congratulated himself for having predicted the future, which I counted at 4, and then he upped that, thankfully, by saying he has a new book coming out where he'll revisit the 150 predictions about the future he made in the past and how 90% of them are right. I am suspicious, frankly, of anybody who claims to know the answers to anything. I think there are lots of good questions we should be asking, but I am suspicious of somebody who is the answer man. Yesterday afternoon, we had his factotum say, and pointed, you don't know anything. You don't know anything. Well, it seems that he's not saying in the helpful philosophical idea, we don't know anything, but rather you don't, but Ray, who's been right about everything, he's the guy we should, hook our wagons to. So I do feel that any one person who feels that they have control over information, knowledge, and what's going to happen should be, I think fear might be too strong a word. Perhaps the comparison I'm making rhetorically on a mountaintop is one which offends, and I can appreciate that. But there's a difference between an ivory tower and a mountain. Mountain's a day hike. Ivory tower's a place you live. I think we should all clear our lungs, go up high, and then go back down and do what we need to do. And one of the things I think we need to do is question people who claim to have all the answers.
Well, I was thinking about what art has to do with machines. And my question is are machines really inherently expressions of art? They're designed, they can express feelings, they can, they can be functional, they can communicate with us. Where's the bright line between human creation and machines and human creation and art?
I think it's very blurry. I don't think it is a sharp place of distinction, as I think everybody here has pointed out. But it's really important, isn't it, for you to remember that machines are man-made. If you keep that in mind, then the whole idea of this sort of otherness coming in to end the human as such and take over seems less real in your word and more like something that has a kind of possible traction to it. Clearly some of these machines are going to help a lot in biomedicine and so on. In terms of art, everyone here seems to think we just go on making art, and it's not because we're indifferent, but because the bifurcation or the duality of that doesn't exist. It doesn't come as a kind of totally dissonant space. And I think for somebody who's young, that's really important to kind of say, look, there's things to do with these things, that are creative and interesting and important and make meaning or help us make meaning.
I wrote a whole book about the fact that the microfilm program was such a terrible thing because it took pictures of big, beautiful newspapers that were printed in 4 colors and it reduced them to these 35 millimeter rectangles of plastic, and that's a bad thing. But I kept thinking, boy, those Recordec microfilm readers are so beautiful. The design, the actual 30s design of the readers, it was a sort of a late deco flowering that happened over at Kodak. And that's always true. That there's this kind of, there's the solution of the problem is how to put a sharp piece of metal through a bunch of paper, and it's called a staple, and that's nice. But the stapler itself can have a bad design or a good design. And there are certain swing line staplers that, really will bring a lump to the throat.
This person in the back there.
Hi, can you hear me? I guess it's really a question about language, or to try to get this discussion somehow to talk about language, and maybe it's a little bit the contrast between Kurzweil's notion of singularity and Wyatt's the notions of singularity that I was getting from your talk with the horses and the person, the sort of freakish human, and the way sort of that notion of singularity that he was presenting really kind of overpowers a different kind of notion of the singularity of each individual. But it's really a question about where language comes in here, and maybe since I think you were all talking about a kind of poetic response to things, whether it's response to the machines or to birds or whatever, if there's some way, maybe starting with you, Anne, I don't want to put that emphasis on you, but if we talk about art and we talk about the machines, that there's some way of calling attention to poetic engagement, whatever that might be, and in relation to the kind of seamlessness of the language that Kurzweil was presenting to us yesterday morning.
Okay, I'll say just the thing that comes to mind is that the act of imagination is almost always an act of resistance and to something. I don't think it's about a kind of I think when people try to make material into form and then to release meaning from that, what they're doing is experiencing resistance. And so that to me is part of the fact of the poetic, is a form of resistance, either on the part of the material or on the part of the person making something. There's a sort of form there. And what the singularity seems to feel, just in the name, just the word of that, seems to have nothing in it that has resistance. It's this oddest kind of thing of pasting our, kind of sort of very, very now exhausted and anxious place of individuation onto this thing called singularity. It's as if you could take that idea and paste it on to this other idea and solve the problem of individuation by doing that. So there's something about, for me, language is always about this kind of possibility of resisting whatever answers are given. It's sort of like, no, wait a minute, I'm going to resist that and go somewhere else.
Well, I believe in the plurality. It's coming. It will be here. Maybe it's already here. Which I guess just means that, you have all these kinds of technologies and things you can do. In ancient Greece, art and technology were the same. Techne, you just make stuff, creative things. If you're a painter, you realize painting is this great technology. It's this art that endures for centuries. You learn these techniques. You can evoke things in the real world or the imagined world. You can just create all this cool stuff. It's worth taking the time to learn how to use any of these tools, many of them, some of them. But don't worry if it takes a lot of time. It shouldn't be too quick, too easy. And I agree with Wyatt, someone who says he has all the answers or his predictions are correct. How could you trust something like that when look what really happened to computers? People thought that, they were going to solve all our problems in the 1950s. They were going to calculate everything. What does a computer become? Something on your desk, with you type on it. And then, people who invented text messaging thought only truck drivers would use it. They couldn't imagine this use of the simpler use of technologies, take over rather than their grand claims. The great works of human beings are more often with time-tested tools that take a long time to spend using and learning, and so they're not likely to be the latest things that are changing and growing so fast. Those are important, but not important in the ways that some of our speakers have thought they are.
There's a Spanish 20th century writer named Javier Marías who's written 30 or 40 books, and he's a very articulate advocate for things poetic or in his word literary. He's translated poetry, written poetry, but mostly he's a novelist. And he says that there's a tradition within novel form, almost forgotten now, which embodies what I call literary thinking, or literary thought. It is a way of thinking which takes place only in literature, the things you never think of or hit upon unless you are writing fiction. Unlike philosophical thinking, which demands an argument without logical flaws and contradictions, literary thinking allows you to contradict yourself. I think poetry and all art welcomes contradiction and celebrates it and allows us to profitably explore it in ourselves.
So that's so great, because I would tie resistance to complication, and then complication, to the sort of sense that the simplicity keeps resisting complexity. And really that quote is so beautiful, because it seems to me that the literary, the language space is one that admits complexity, is interested in complexity, no matter what solution, no matter what the iambic pentameter is. There's a kind of will to complexity in art making generally, I think. I think we have time for one last question. So maybe it should be from the very back of the room on that side.
I wanted to speak up yesterday when Kurzweil lost me in the second part of his talk. In fact, he put me into a stupor, which I didn't come out of until a panel. By the way, you're a very sweet, well, that's not the right word, interesting theory of evolution, you know. It should be the most interesting things that survive. But anyways, I was thinking you were the easiest panel for a minute or two because it's my domain, the mountaintop, and some poetry, and a pina colada. But you're actually the most difficult panel, now that I'm thinking about it. More difficult than Kurzweil or David Rose, who made me feel like I was going to be forced to have sex with 1 million micro robots on crack cocaine.
I don't think we need a question after that. I think we just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.